Escalation without an exit. Putin's war with no endgame. There is a phrase that explains the Ukraine war better than any battlefield map or casualty number. Escalation without an endgame. That is where Vladimir Putin stands today. What began as a confident gamble, a swift strike meant to break Ukraine in days, has turned into a grinding disaster that Russia cannot escape. Putin cannot stop the war, because stopping would mean admitting failure. And failure, in an authoritarian system like Russia's, is often fatal. But he also cannot win the war in any meaningful way. Even a battlefield victory would leave Russia weaker, poorer, and dangerously unstable. So Putin does the only thing left to him. He escalates. To understand why, we need to go back, not to 2022, but much further. Back to a man, a mindset, and a dream that shaped everything that followed. Vladimir Putin is not driven by short-term politics. He is driven by history, or rather, his version of it. A former KGB officer, Putin grew up watching the Soviet Union collapse. To him, that collapse was not liberation. It was humiliation, loss, a theft of greatness. Over the years, he has spoken openly about it, calling the fall of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. But Putin's ambitions go even deeper than the USSR. He sees himself in the shadow of Russian emperors, the czars, and especially Peter the Great. Like them, he believes Russia is destined to dominate its neighborhood. Borders, in his worldview, are temporary. Power is permanent. Ukraine, in that story, is not a sovereign country. It is a missing piece of empire. That belief was not accidental. It shaped every major decision Putin made long before tanks crossed Ukraine's borders. When Putin returned to the presidency in 2012, after a brief constitutional break, Russia quietly changed course. The country entered an era of austerity. Government spending tightened. Savings increased. Ordinary Russians were told to endure hardship for long-term stability. At the time, it looked like economic discipline. In reality, it was war preparation. Russia stockpiled money. Reserves grew. Defense industries were prioritized. The Kremlin understood something crucial. Wars are not won by speeches or flags. They are won by cash, logistics, and endurance. The world largely ignored these warning signs. By the time Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the blueprint was already clear. Ukraine was not a one-off operation. It was a rehearsal. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, Putin believed the war would be over almost immediately. Internal assessments suggested Kyiv would fall within days. Ukrainian leadership would flee. The army would collapse. Western nations would protest loudly and then move on. None of that happened. Ukraine fought back, harder than anyone expected. Western weapons poured in. Russian supply lines crumbled. Entire armored columns were destroyed. The war that was supposed to be quick became slow. Brutal. Public. Worst of all for Putin, it became undeniable. The image of Russian military superiority shattered in real time. As the months turned into years, the war began consuming Russia itself. The cost was staggering, not just in money, but in people, credibility, and future potential. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire towns across Russia quietly emptied of young men. To keep fighting, the Kremlin poured money into the defense sector. Factories expanded. Loans were pushed onto private banks. Defense contractors borrowed massively to meet impossible demands. On paper, it looked sustainable. In reality, Russia was building a war economy on debt that someone would eventually have to pay. By 2024 and 2025, Putin faced a brutal truth. There was no clean exit. A peace deal would require concessions. Sanctions relief would require compromise. Frozen assets would remain frozen. Ukraine would not surrender its territory. So Russia escalated. More drones, more missiles, more recruits. Prisoners were sent to the front. Cash bonuses tempted desperate men. Training was shortened. Casualties rose even faster. At the same time, Putin publicly spoke of peace while privately expanding the war. This contradiction was not confusion. It was survival. In Putin's system, ending the war without victory would invite blame. And blame invites challengers. Russia's wartime economy appeared strong until it didn't. Industrial growth slowed. Defense factories struggled to hire workers. Wages stagnated. Corporate debt ballooned. Banks carried liabilities that could collapse the system if the war slowed down. Behind closed doors, Russia's elite understood the danger. The very oligarchs who benefited from defense spending now faced financial ruin if the war machine stalled. Their loyalty depended on continued escalation. Putin had trapped not only himself, but everyone around him. One of the most dangerous moments for any autocrat is when bad news stops reaching the top. Putin has spent years replacing independent power centers with loyalists. The result is absolute control and total isolation. Officials tell him what he wants to hear. Military reports exaggerate success. Losses are minimized. Reality is filtered. History shows how this ends. When leaders stop hearing the truth, wars last longer and casualties rise. Even if the war stopped tomorrow, Russia would face a crisis unlike anything since the Soviet collapse. Hundreds of thousands of traumatized soldiers would return to a shrinking economy. Jobs would be scarce. Violence would rise. Crime already has. Birth rates are collapsing. Entire age groups are missing. A generation has been consumed. Ending the war would not bring peace. It would bring chaos. So why doesn't Putin stop? Because stopping means facing everything he has postponed. Economic collapse, elite betrayal, social unrest, historical judgment. As long as the war continues, blame can be externalized, sacrifice can be justified, control can be maintained. The war has become Putin's shield, even as it destroys the country beneath him. Putin's war no longer has a military objective. It has become personal. Escalation is no longer a tactic. It is the only direction left. More destruction, more loss, more denial. The war may not end with victory or defeat, but with exhaustion, collapse, or the disappearance of the man who started it. And when that moment comes, Russia will still be left to face the wreckage. Because escalation without an endgame is not strategy. It is delay. And delay always runs out. This is And a Climb.